Hey everybody, I'm back because I promised you yesterday that I would come back and give you a little bit more to the story that I started yesterday. Sorry, I look pretty nasty. I had CC all day today and I was sweating the whole day and running around like a chicken with my head cut off. So I'm looking pretty rough. Sorry about that. So anyway, I wanted to get back to where I left off yesterday, which was after Aaron had a seizure in the bathroom at our house in Moequa in 2009. And so I kind of left off after they came and took him to the hospital. And what ended up happening is we got to the hospital and he was put in a bed, and I kept telling them that he was having seizures, and nobody would believe me. Nobody would believe us. And so they were just kind of monitoring him. They had done some blood work, and I kept saying, he's having seizures. And finally, he's laying there in the bed, and we notice him starting to do the same thing again. And he went right back into another grand mal seizure. And unfortunately, this time, Aaron's dad and brother were both right there with him. And we were all three standing around him, and I was praying, and I had to have been just a really scary thing for Mike and Seth, just being there for that. And so I'm talking to Aaron as he's seizing, and the nurse looks at me and she says, "You know he can't hear you, right?" And I just about lost it. I left the room at that point. Well, I shouldn't say room. It was in the emergency room, so it was a curtain. So I went out and shut the curtain behind me, and I remember Aaron's aunt coming out, and she's a nurse, and she was there with us, and she said, no, Janet, this is a good thing. It's good that he's having one right there, so that they can see it and they know what it is. And I was bawling. I was just losing my mind, because I was obviously so emotional. And then the nurse telling me that he couldn't hear me when I was talking to him and praying over him just sent me over the edge. And so I was standing outside that curtain just freaking out. And so I got myself calmed back down and went back in. And at that point, finally, they said, okay, we're going to go ahead and do an MRI. Now, this was, mind you, our third time to the hospital with seizures. Finally, we get an MRI. And so we're just thankful at that point, because we're thinking, okay, we're going to get some answers to why he's having seizures. And so they sent him for his MRI, and then he ended up going up to the ICU because he had continued to have seizures, and they wanted to make sure that they were monitoring him. And I remember the MRI results came back, and Aaron's doctor came up and said, well, we figured it out. We know what's going on. And we were like, okay, what is it? And he said he has a glioma. And we were all kind of like, okay, what does that mean? So immediately, of course, I start Googling and figure out pretty quickly that it's a brain tumor. And I remember at that point, they even said, okay, we're going to have an oncologist come up and talk to you. And Aaron's aunt was like, yeah, we're gonna get Dr. So-and-so to come up and talk to you. He's the best oncologist. And so that should have been a hint for us at that point that it was pretty serious. But so the oncologist came up, and he was like, basically, okay, it's a brain tumor, and what's going to have to happen is he's going to have surgery, and it's probably benign, but we're going to have to take it out. And, if it's not, then he's going to have chemo and radiation. And, but we're not going to talk about that yet because we don't know. So we're going to have to set up the surgery and, get that going. So, at that point, of course, we're in pretty big shock. I remember thinking, okay, it's a brain tumor. We can deal with this. And especially then when they're talking about it being benign, I'm like, okay, we can do this. And so we went home, they scheduled the surgery, and we began praying. And we put the word out to as many people as we could that we needed prayer, that we needed everybody that knew Aaron to start praying. And we were just praying that the surgery would go well and that it would be benign. And I don't even think that we knew half of the risks at that point. And in all honesty, I don't think either one of us really wanted to know those things, because at that point we both were just really realizing how important our faith in God was, and that there's really no point in listening to something that's not of God. And so at that point, the doctor, the neurosurgeon, told us that Aaron was going to need to go up to Chicago to have a mapping MRI done of his brain. And the reason that they do this is because when you have a brain tumor and they do surgery, you can very easily get into some parts of the brain where you're going to have lasting effects. And the tumor that Aaron had was in the left frontal lobe, and it was kind of between his motor skills portion of the brain and the communication portion of the brain. And so they were concerned about that. They were concerned about, making sure that they did the least amount of damage when they went in to get the tumor out. So his neurosurgeon wanted him to go for this mapping MRI. And so they scheduled it. I remember I was very big and pregnant. I went, Aaron's dad went, and his brother went up to the mapping MRI. And this was just another time when we just really, I saw God. And we sat down in the waiting room, and they called Aaron to go back. And I had sat down next to this dark-skinned gentleman, and he looked like he was maybe Indian or something. And I kind of looked over and noticed that he had a big scar on his head. And so we were at the University of Illinois hospital up in Chicago, and so I kind of kept looking, because I'm like, I wonder if he's had a brain tumor. And so finally I said hello, and he said hi, and he had a thick accent, and he started talking to me, and we just were kind of talking about nothing too serious, just random things. And finally I said, "Is that scar on your head from a tumor?" And he said yes. And I was like, wow, okay. And he said I was diagnosed with a grade 3 anaplastic astrocytoma a year ago. And he began to tell me his story. And he said that he had started having seizures, and that he had gone to the hospital, and they had done an MRI, found out that there was a tumor, that he had an anaplastic astrocytoma. And then he told me that he would have to be that he had gone through chemo and radiation. He had done 6 weeks of radiation and a full year of chemo. And I asked him all kinds of questions about what he had gone through. I asked him what it was like. I asked him if he got sick. I asked him if he needed help. He told me that he was in America by himself, that his family was still in India, and that he went through the whole thing on his own. He did all the radiation on all the chemotherapy all by himself, and it just so happened that he was doing incredibly well, and he was there for his 1-year MRI after having the tumor removed and going through all the treatment. And I said, "How are you?" And he was like, "I'm really good." And his name was Gene. I'll always remember. His name was Gene, he told me. And little did I know at that point that everything that Gene said to me would apply in Aaron's upcoming battle. Everything. Gene was almost the exact same age as Aaron was at the time. And the diagnosis that we received, the second diagnosis that we received, the first diagnosis was that Aaron had a glioblastoma. That was the diagnosis indicator. But the second diagnosis that we received was that he had an anaplastic astrocytoma. And as I'm finishing up this conversation with Gene, all of a sudden they call his name to go back to get his MRI, and he stands up to go, and he hands me a piece of paper, and he says, "Give this to your husband." And I was like, "What?" He said, "This is what got me through. Give it to your husband." And I said, "Okay." And then he was gone. And I opened up the piece of paper, and on it was the scripture, Isaiah 43:10. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I'm not gonna get it right, but the end of it is, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." I need to look it up and get the whole thing, but it's about not being afraid and knowing that God is gonna uphold you with his righteous right hand. And I was just blown away in that moment by the gift that God had given us. And many times when I think back on that experience, I know that Gene was an angel that God sent, and there was just no other explanation for it to me. Whether he was a human angel or a spiritual angel or whatever, it didn't really matter to me, because what he brought to us that day at that MRI, at that mapping MRI, was so priceless and so valuable. Like, it just was incredible. And I feel like it was God's gift to just tell me, this is exactly what's coming, and you're going to get through it, and it's going to be okay. And so in terms of building our faith, that was huge. And so that day when Aaron got out, I gave him that scripture, and that was one of many things. It was the start of many things that brought so much faith to us as we walked into this battle. Because we really, at that point, we didn't know what was ahead of us. We knew that there was a battle coming, but we didn't know exactly what it was going to be like. We didn't know what the diagnosis was. We didn't know that he was going to be told that he needed to go home and get his affairs in order. We didn't know any of those things at that point. So God was already preparing us. He was already giving us hope, and he was already giving us a mustard seed of faith to hold on to. So I will leave you with that this evening, and I will give you some more in the coming weeks. Kind of keep continuing on into our story and into our testimony. Hope you guys have a great night. Bye.